Well, good evening, everyone, and apologies for the tardiest debate starting I think I've ever known or seen. I know there are people who are still going to filter in, and my plan of action tonight is simply start, because I think that seems quite important. So yeah, many apologies for that, we're starting so late. I hope you enjoyed the hustings at the very least, and the chance to see our candidates in person for the first time in a very, very long time. But yes, we will get going, and we will get going as quickly as we can to make up for our horrendous lateness. The motion before the House tonight is this House believes the future of Labour is conservatism. And the rules, very briefly, for those of you who are new and who have had this as their first taste of our debate, is we have 6 speakers, 3 on either side. Each of them have 10 minutes. In the first and last minutes of their speeches, that will be protected time. Then the intervening 8 minutes, I would encourage all of you to stand up and say point of information or on that point or worse to that effect if you feel that what they've said is something that you object to. After every pair of 2 speeches, we will pause for a round of floor speeches, and I will ask for speeches of 2 minutes in proposition, abstention, and opposition of the motion. With all of that being said, once we're done, you'll go through those doors to vote, the noes, the abstention door in the middle, and the ayes on that side, and we will announce the result and the swing of the debate in the bar afterwards. I think that covers everything, and we're getting people back, which is even better. So I think, to save everyone's blushes, we will now begin properly with Maurice Glasman, who is a political theorist, an academic, a social commentator, and a Labour life peer in the House of Lords. Maurice is widely known for establishing Blue Labour, a conservative form of socialism within the Labour Party, and I'm delighted to welcome him tonight. Maurice.
Thank you. Where do I start? Here. Okay, so hi everybody. It's thanks for the invitation. Nice to be here. I was a student here once, just to let you know, about 40 years ago. So I had to come back eventually. So here I am, and I'm speaking tonight in support of the motion that the future of Labour is conservative, and that is because capitalism is revolutionary. What capitalism does, it's late, so I can use the word, it commodifies creation itself. It turns human beings and nature into commodities for sale in the open market. So relationships, community, the very humanity of the person needs to be protected. And that was the form, that was the meaning of Labour. I think it still remains the meaning of Labour, which is a democratic and profoundly anti-revolutionary movement, because memory and matter, physical matter, exists through time, and it can't be eviscerated by denial and effacement. So in other words, the relentless mantra of change ignores the fact that people want to preserve a sense of place, preserve a sense of community, and above all, preserve the integrity of human association. And that is what is threatened by not only capitalism, but a form of the administrative state that also undermines relationships, place, and the fundamental integrity of democratic association. So the era that you've lived in for virtually all your life, I call it the era of globalization, an era of terrible monstrosity and fantasy, in which the idea was that there was nothing you could do about technology negating borders, treaties subordinating democracy, that capital degraded labour, that the very existence of labour as a human factor was somehow an enemy of progress. And this was a fate that could not be resisted. Now, what you have lived through is the Brexit referendum and the 2019 general election, which give an indication of how deluded that assumption was. So we're now in a new era. I know I'm at Cambridge, and I know that Cambridge was the bastion of the Protestant Reformation, so forgive my heresy in quoting Pope Francis. And he said that we're living not in an era of change, but a change of era. And the new era that we're living in should be perfect for Labour politics, in that there will be a greater role for the nation state in the economy, that the working class, far from being, what did we call them, the left behind, the abandoned, just a remnant of a previous political era, they're the decisive class. The working class remain the decisive class in politics and the places that they live in. the abandoned, desecrated, disinvested places, what they call in America flyover country. That's the very battleground of politics. So a connection to place, the inheritance of democracy, and the endurance of attachment, the abandonment of these things has left my party stranded. But I think that the Labour tradition itself is the source of its renewal. So Labour's not the Whigs or the Liberal Party in disguise. It's a great and distinctive national movement through which many rivers run. Labour is radical and conservative, Catholic and Protestant, secular and religious, leveller and Laudian, national and internationalist. So here's another nasty word. It's a paradoxical party. A paradox is something essentially that sounds wrong but is right. You know, something like tradition should shape modernity, or the old is the new. It's a radical tradition, and the fundamental... Pardon? Please.
If you want Labour to be the pro-capitalist austerity de-escalation party, how far right and minimal do you want the Tories to be?
Okay, so point of information, I'm not quite used to it, is obviously I would really oppose austerity, I would really resist capitalism, and I would really resist all of those things. So you're just going to have to take my word on that. And I think that will become clearer as we go on. It's the whole point of Labour is to resist the domination of capital and to do that through democratic association. And the fundamental idea and the link with the conservatism, which has been lost, is to retrieve a notion of a home in the world, of a community, of a place to live. And this was formed following the dispossession of the enclosures, and the idea was to retrieve this human status for workers. So this is this idea of commodification. So commodification is the idea that something that wasn't produced for sale, a human being, nature, is turned into a commodity for sale in the open market. And that is the fundamental process of capitalism, which wishes to create a price system for all forms of existence. And Labour came in to say, no, the human being is not a commodity. That was the meaning of the trade union movement. That was the meaning of the formation of the Labour Party, that having a home shouldn't be dependent on the price system, and that through democracy, through politics, you could resist the idea that human beings are just a fungible commodity to be exploited and discarded. And so that is the fundamental truth that I'm arguing about the Labour tradition, is that it is a democratic movement to resist capitalism through democratic association. As another great dehumanizer put it, what happens under capitalism is all that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned. So Blue Labour, which is the movement of which I am part, began as a recognition. The first meaning is the word blue, as sadness. I'm kind of blue. It was in fact originally called Kind of Blue Labour, but that went away. And it began as a recognition of the sadness and demoralisation that had fallen upon the party, movement and tradition around 2008, the time of the financial crash, where this coalition between finance capital and the administrative state kind of began to fall apart. And of all the statements that Labour has made over the years, perhaps the least true is that things can only get better. Okay, I'm just letting you all know that that's ontologically wrong, it's politically wrong, and it's historically wrong. Things can get worse, as we know. And so there's got to be a tragic component to the understanding, and that's part of the kind of blue thing. And it is the lack of understanding of loss and tragedy that requires that we re-articulate the fundamental beliefs and practices of the Labour tradition. So we begin with the idea that human beings are not commodities, but social beings, creative and social beings, longing for relationship, for connection and meaning. The second idea is that nature is not a commodity either, but a condition of life and a sacred inheritance. The Labour tradition also asserted that democracy is the best way to resist the domination of the rich and the educated, and that the leadership and participation of the working class was central to this. In other words, it was a vision of a democracy, locational and vocational. And Labour also drew upon historical memory and not only rational argument. It drew upon the Norman yoke and the tradition of the freeborn for the solidarity required by its associations. It not only demanded a human status for Labour, but a move from the contractual to the covenantal, an idea of politics as binding people together in mutual obligation so that you could resist finance capital, that the state and politics was the means through which you could bind capital and subordinate it to other interests, most particularly the labour interest. And the fundamental idea there that was sovereignty was required to domesticate capital. It also needs to be said that within the Labour tradition, does this mean I've got a minute? Wow. You see? Okay, so I just wanted to say that the liberties were absolutely vital to Labour. So I really mistimed my speech, so I'll just sum up with the idea that a sense of that the human status of the person, the integrity of relationship and association, the drawing upon the memory of historical struggle in order to achieve those things, the restoration of a sense of place and of politics and democratic politics as the means of resisting that are the fundamental teachings of the labour movement. And in resisting this technological dehumanization and accelerationism, this is sometimes thought to be conservative, but Labour's tradition itself is far too conservative to ever have anything to do with the Tory party. It's about people organising themselves and acting together in order to retrieve their human status from the degradation and exploitation that is always present. Thank you.
Thank you, Maurice, ever so much for that. We will move swiftly on tonight to our second speaker, our first speaker for the opposition. Jessica Asato is a Labour politician who previously acted as the Director of Progress and as Vice Chair of the Fabian Society. A former student of Trinity Hall, Jessica was involved in David Miliband's leadership election campaign and is currently the Head of Policy and Public Affairs for the children's charity Barnardo's. Jessica, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Keir. It's absolutely delightful to be back here after so many years, pretty much 20. I'm so grateful to Keir, Tommy, Safer and all of the union team. I know just how hard it is to make debates like these such a success. The opposition today is going to speak in three parts. First, I'm going to address why socially we must unite around what we have in common rather than what divides us. Eleanor will look at this through the sweep of Labour history. And Ben Bradshaw will set out how Labour wins through a progressive, outward-looking roadmap for the whole of the UK. I'd like to start by saying that Maurice and Paul clearly have a proud history of working within the Labour movement, Paul representing his community and the workers that he's manned the barricades with. I'd also like to say where we agree. We agree on the need to provide working people with secure, well-paid jobs which reflect their skills and talent. We agree that Labour must speak to the lived experience of those who feel left behind or who have not had their needs met, not least in the last 11 years. And I hope we agree, if I've read Paul's book rightly, that the future of Labour is Labour. Well, perhaps if we did, then we could all just go for a drink and this debate wouldn't happen. What we can't agree on, I guess, is blue Labour or conservatism. And that's partly because we don't take that blue and sad and pessimistic perspective that I think characterises much of what Maurice and Paul writes about. Things did get better. Child poverty came down under the years of the Labour government. Unemployment, particularly for young people and those furthest from the labour market, came down under the Labour government. Hospitals and schools were rebuilt. There were very few leaky roofs or kids 40 to a class after a Labour government. I simply do not share the pessimism of those on the proposition. Many of you won't have been very, very much born in those years, but I was coming to Cambridge at a time when actually there was hope, there was optimism, and actually many great things were done. Where we also disagree in is our vision of whether the country since the 1960s has been all to the bad. And to some degree, whether the working class, as characterised by Paul and Maurice, still think like they did then. So first, just a few social trends. In 2012, 6 in 10 people said that they were working class. Very, very similar to 1983. Though the salience of class has declined substantially, and there are new multiple ways in which people form attitudes and identities. Let's look at the proportion of people who support same-sex marriage. 43% of C2DEs, and I know you don't characterise that, Paul, as your definition of working class, but we have to start somewhere. In 2021, 43% of C2DEs supported same-sex marriage, with just 10% who opposed. And that in itself was an increase of 4% since 2019. In 2015, 47% of C2DEs said that they would like to take more than 2 weeks paternity leave. So this suggests that actually the working class that you refer to is progressive. It shares liberal values that are much in common with other classes in this country. We've moved forward hugely. Where is this social conservative clamour to go back to the future of the 1960s? I think my worry about your analysis is that you're conflating the anti-liberal views you might hold with a significant majority of the working class rather than a subset. I also worry that you conclude that progressive views on race, gender, sexuality, and internationalism are somehow antithetical to the Labour tradition, whereas we will contend that they simply are not. It is the proud heritage of Labour and the trade union movement which fought to secure suffrage for women's equal pay, civil rights for Black people, and while I understand the film Pride is not a documentary about the gay and lesbian campaigns in the 1980s, there are enough people who remember the role that some trade unions played in shifting those liberation campaigns. Not just here, but also abroad, South Africa, for example. So your fundamental argument is that Labour must place these things at the heart of its campaign, I guess, to win back government: home, place, family, relationships, work, and the nation. I mean, taking your essential thesis of these values, I agree. I don't think anybody in the Labour Party would disagree with these words. But the devil here is in the detail. It's in the specifics of what that means for people in their everyday lives. What if the family life you live is coercive? Every night as a wife, you're expected to have tea on the table at 5. You're not allowed or expected to have outside interests. You are subjugated to the interests of your husband. It is a very nice life for him. It may be a nuclear family life for him. But for you, you are not free. What if the family life you have as a young person, thinking that you may be gay, what if that feels oppressive? The weight of shame from your parents and your community hanging over you. That is oppressive. That's not freedom. What if you give everything to Britain, your new nation, the place that has given you your shelter and saved your life, but you are shunned because you're brown, and while you speak English fluently, you do so with an accent? That is not freedom, that is oppressive. But it may make some people feel that they have home, place, family, relationships, work, and their nation back. Your analysis misses out all the fundamental. I will give way.
I mean, would the Speaker accept that it is possible to defend the concept of family without supporting coercive relationships or the idea that women should be chained to the kitchen sink, and to support the idea of immigration controls without harbouring any innate racism?
Oh, I absolutely agree. I 100% agree, and that is exactly what Labour does and always has done. And in fact, actually, Labour has had a progressive view of family, for a very, very long time. Nobody in the Labour Party has said that we want to see families split up and divorce increase. What we've said is that we want to take a progressive view of what family means to the vast majority of people in this country, many of whom are in mixed race families, many of whom have gay parents, for example, many of whom adopt, many of whom can't have children at all, many of whom become kinship carers when they're grandparents for their children if their parents pass away. There are many types of family, and what we say on the Labour side is that we accept these, our new types of family. We don't shun them, we welcome them, and we make people feel as though that family is just as important as any other concept. One of the things that I think that your analysis misses out is the fundamental uniqueness of us all. Our earliest childhood experiences, those of love and nurture, or those of abuse and fear, shape our brains within the first 1,001 days. Whatever class our children are born into, trauma can have a long-lasting and life-altering effect. We also know that difference is essential for flourishing, for advancement, with new ideas and new challenges. My abiding worry about your perspective is that it tells people, stay in your lane. Don't aspire. Don't dream. Don't push yourself to the minute. Don't challenge authority.
On that point,
I give way.
would you say that, therefore, that conservative values are standing completely in opposition to anybody having aspiration when, over the last 80 years, certainly in electoral terms, that's never seemed to be the case? Conservative parties supported aspiration.
Well, it's supported aspiration for those at the very top. And as we're seeing with every Conservative government, that actually those at the top have got much, much wealthier, while those at the bottom haven't seen any sort of redistribution. If you look at the Labour government, it was the most, I won't give way. On that point, the Labour government was the most redistributive government that we have seen. And under this government, what we've seen is the gap between child poverty widen and widen. So no, I don't think that Conservative governments represent aspiration for the majority of the UK at all. I just wanted to say, finally, one of the things that I worry about the way in which you look at the world, comes from a Christian hymn. The poor man's in his castle, the rich man's in his castle, the poor man's at his gate. The Lord God made them high and lowly and ordered their estate. That is why I do not believe the future of this house is Conservative. The future of this house is Labour, and only Labour can determine that future for this country. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Jessica. If we can have a degree of quiet over the house, perfect. I would like to come now to some floor speeches. I see a hand very quickly to speak in I Hope proposition. Proposition? Yes, right, in which case we will go here for our first floor speech of the night. Is there a microphone? Yes.
No, I can't remember the exact passage I want to quote. But, I have, in speaking in 3 points in proposition, based just off what the last speaker for opposition said. First, as someone who's in favour of this motion, and someone who would say is sympathetic to the aims and causes of Blue Labour, and who has indeed read Mr. Embury's book, and who disagrees with the characterisation of it just now, that there are indeed ways in which one can think about community and think about stability and think about the nation and our shared identity in a way that isn't exclusive, in a way that isn't subjecting other people to, negative practices, whether that's in the home or abuse on the street or other sorts of areas. And so that comes to the idea of conservatism, progressivism in a Whiggish sense, and revolution. Some of the things that bind us are not revolutionary or not progressive. They are our families, the people we care about most, our friends, our places of work, the people we socialize within a very small circle. And then those circles interact with other circles, and that binds an entire village, and then a town, and then a city, and then an entire nation. And change. What is change? The idea that change and progress, gay marriage, race relations acts, the Equality Act, these are not incompatible with conservatism. And the person who spoke and gave the POI had a good point. For the past 80 years, the Conservatives have governed for most of our lives, for most of our parents' lives, most of our grandparents' lives. The achievements of Labour and the achievements of New Labour were transient. Where was Britain after 13 years of New Labour, of unabashed progressivism? In terms of race relations, we had the British National Party polling at an all-time high, a party that wanted to deport people who weren't white. We had the lowest trust in politicians in a generation. We had one of the most unequal societies we've had in this country's post-war and 20th century history. The Gini coefficient doesn't lie, I'm afraid. It got greater under Mr. Blair and Mr. Brown than it was even beforehand. And according to my friend here, it is lower now. So I understand I'm going on for a bit. This is suffice to say that positive social change is not incompatible with conservatism. No. It's not incompatible with conservatism. And that if we want change as a group or as a society, we have to figure out what binds us together. How can a community or a trade union fight the people at the top for change? And it's only through these conservative values that those changes can be effected, and not through a Whiggish idea of history that, as Lord Glasman rightly diminished, things can only get better. Thank you very much.
Hold on. Thank you very much, Roshan. Might I remind people at this juncture the floor speeches are 2 minutes. I cannot emphasise that enough. Do we have anyone who would like to speak in abstention who isn't as obviously nepotistic as me going here is? There's a hand there.
I'm not going to make an active case for abstention, but I do want to make a case for the sake of having this debate. And I think Maurice Glasman spoke for 10 minutes about what globalisation means for Britain and for Labour's values. And globalisation wasn't mentioned once in the first speech from the opposition. I don't think the debate about Blue Labour is remotely productive when it's mostly anti-Blue Labour people making up that Blue Labour holds certain very socially outdated positions that it doesn't. I think we can have a far more productive debate if you engage with the two fundamental Blue Labour tenets, that globalisation of labour is a bad thing for workers and globalisation of capital is a bad thing for states. And I think if we start to engage with the core tenet of Blue Labour, that is, sovereignty alone has the power to domesticate capital, then I think only then can we have a debate that leads anywhere and says things about what the future of our party might be. As it is, I don't think talking about social issues that nobody disagrees on is particularly a productive way of having this debate.
Thank you very much, Johnny. And now, do we have anyone who would like to speak in opposition? You can volunteer if you're up. You were just going for abstention. Do we have anyone? There's someone at the back right away over there. I think we'll go there.
Hi, my name's David Evans. I'm at Gomlin Keyes College. I'd just like to say that, just to be sort of pernickety, I do this, I'm a history student, I have to look at the provenance of the question and the debate. The question, while obviously intended to address Blue Labour, is talking about conservatism specifically and more broadly. And now, I know the tenets of Blue Labour, I'm aware of the arguments there, of the specific globalisation aspects of it. But the question asking about conservatism, to me anyway, I'm not sure if anyone agrees with this, is problematic because, in my view, the UK already has a Conservative Party that is very electorally successful. It wins a lot of elections, it has a lot of MPs, it's our current government. And I don't think it's productive for the state of our country to have another party espousing those similar viewpoints. And I think that's highly unproductive for democracy as a concept in the UK. And it undermines that democratic principle that is central to Britain and to British people. And I think if you look back to times when Labour has moved towards the centre of the political divide and espouse more conservative views, which was mentioned by the sort of previous floor speaker as a bastion of progressivism, which I would highly contend, that many of those problems and the conditions that were ended up being left behind by those governments and that decisions were as a result of the move to Labour towards a more conservative position and the lack of choice between the two parties in the British political system. I yield.
When Labour moved to the centre ground, they were in government for 30 years. Are you suggesting that Labour remain further left purely to act as opposition in a democratic society rather than actually win government?
I understand that point, and I think it's valid to state the electoral consequences and the electoral benefits of moving towards the centre. But I think, if you catch me at the bar earlier, I will rant at you constantly about the problems with the UK's electoral system in giving democratic choice. But I'd just like to address that point by saying that there's no point in having elections if the two parties hold the same views. So what's the point of a Labour in power if they're not going to substantially change things from what already exists?
Thank you very much, everyone, for that round of floor speeches. There will be another opportunity in 2 speeches' time to contribute, should you wish. For now, however, we will come to our third speaker of the night and our second for the proposition. Poppy Coburn is another recent Cambridge graduate who now works as a freelance writer. A former editorial trainee at Unheard, her recent hits include Why She Abandoned the Performative Extinction Rebellion. Poppy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Keir, for that introduction. I'm an extremely recent Cambridge graduate. I actually graduated this year, and anybody that remembers me from my time at Cambridge will know that I was a pretty hardcore left-winger, more towards the Marxist side of things. And I think, to a certain extent, that political tradition has stuck with me. I believe that class is real. It's not an identity, it's not a feeling, it's not some kind of whimsical tradition, it's a reality. And I think, unfortunately, in a lot of internal debates in the Labour Party, we like to get caught up in feeling and emotion when that is completely irrelevant to the debate. The Labour Party is very much stuck in the past, and that still goes for the more progressive elements of the Labour Party. For example, the Blairites like to pretend that we still live in the same social conditions and economic conditions of the 90s. We don't. Things are extremely different today. And indeed, in the far left faction of the Labour Party, which likes to present itself as having a forward-facing vision, is stuck in the 80s. And I take that as I believe that's true because of the obsession with Margaret Thatcher and the continued obsession of referring to certain communities as former mining communities, when the more accurate term now would be Amazon fulfillment centre communities. There is a very much reluctance within left-wing speakers to actually consider class as it exists today. And I think that's because it brings up some quite uncomfortable questions about the very makeup of the Labour Party. Who does the Labour Party actually represent today? It's certainly not the working people. We don't just need to look at the 2019 election to know that the working people roundly resented the Labour Party's positions. And they did not do so because they were bigoted. They did not do so because they were reactionary. They did so because they knew it was not in their interest to vote for a party that was not representing them. And I would like to make what I believe to be a little bit more clear. Now, there's a man called Michael Lind. He's an American social theorist and sociologist. I don't want to bore you all with a sociology lecture, but I think this is relevant. There's a class today which is extremely predominant, has been since the 1980s and 1990s. It's called the professional managerial class. It is members in middle management, HR, and students, any kind of bureaucratic job. They have an outmoded influence in society today. They set the cultural agenda, and they are in a distinct class warfare between working people in this country. They are essentially parasitic. These are the people that tell us we must think in terms of feelings, in terms of goodness, in terms of morality, but they don't actually want to get down to brass tacks, and that is what would benefit the working people of this country. And guess what? It's not nice platitudes, it's actual policy. Now, Boris Johnson has been an extremely effective politician because he has understood, at least partly, that he can win using electoral strategy, which takes in his old traditional, older Tory base with culture war rubbish. And he can also pick up the red wall voters by offering some kind of scraps of economic, uplifting in the north, levelling up, things like that. Now, the Labour Party offers nothing. It is too cowardly to actually put forward a genuinely progressive agenda. And by that, I mean actively, unashamedly saying that the working class is the class that represents the Labour Party and therefore dictates the policy. We would much rather come on our high horse and say the working class should believe this, the working class should do this, the working class must be more progressive, the working class must agree with our opinions on the European Union, the working class must agree with our opinions on benefits. Yes?
I don't recall either of the last two Labour Party manifestos telling the working class what to think.
What are you talking about? What do you mean by that?
Well, the manifestos, from what I recall, set out the policy of the Labour Party and what it was offering working people. I don't seem to recall telling them how to think.
Yeah, to a certain extent, I agree. Most manifestos don't explicitly bash the people that they want to vote for them. They certainly did a pretty good job of it by tarring a broad section of the country as being somehow bigoted for voting for Brexit, for example. And it's difficult to say this because, this is a room full of people who is generally, myself included, in the same sort of class. We are highly educated. We are going to be graduating into a world where we are have a very privileged position to be walking into. And it's quite difficult for us to then go to the people who are, not university graduates, haven't jumped through all the procedural hoops that we have and say, actually, we need your votes. And the Conservative Party has done a pretty good job at being able to stoop to that. Now, the problem is they're not really conservative. They don't really care about family and they don't really care about community. That's very clear from most of their policies. They like to use culture war things to get people on board with them, but conservatism is very much not in their policy aside from their name. Now, I think something like Blue Labour, yeah?
Conservatism isn't anything to do with Labour, and why you're proposing that the future of Labour is conservatism.
Yeah, of course. I think conservatism is something that is innately working class. I think most working class sentiment has a degree of social conservatism to it. No matter what people want to believe, most working people just want what's best for their family and community, and trying to pretend otherwise is delusional.
May I suggest an alternative perspective, which is the reason the Conservative Party is successful in winning votes of the working class is because they have those conservative values.
I think that's difficult to say. I mean, what kind of conservative values are you mentioning here? I mean, aside from certain kind of cultural debates about locking up statues so they can't be vandalised, most of the reason why they've been able to win over the Red Wall is because of the new policies they've been doing in levelling up. It's been immensely successful in winning over those former seats, which Labour Party offered only paltry things in comparison and was quite happy to ignore. I think the illusions of support can only really be held for so long, and I think most progressive in the audience will agree with me that what worked for Blair can no longer work for Keir Starmer. Something new needs to be come up with, something bold and forward-thinking, and I think the most simple way you can do that is simply to go to the working people of this country and ask, what do you want? What do you actually want? We're not telling you what to think. We're not telling you that you're wrong. But what would make you vote for us? What is your vision for the future of Britain? And I think before we go into any moralisation about introspection and getting very emotional about what it means to be Labour and the traditions of the Chartists or whatever, we should simply just go to the working people, the people who are the reason this fat party was founded in the first place, and say, what do you want? What would you like us to do?
What makes you think what they would want would be certain?
Any effective Labour politician in the last century has understood that socially conservative policies are overwhelmingly popular amongst working people. Even someone like Tony Blair understood that. I mean, a lot of the reason why he was so popular in certain working class areas because of his strong support on, for example, anti-crime. Now, people, as I said earlier, people only fall for one thing once. He obviously was not good for the working classes in any way, in any long-term perspective. But I do believe if you want to gain power in the country today, that's something you have to consider.
If you're saying Blair was entirely unsuccessful, first of all, how do you explain the fact that child poverty fell during this term, spending on education and healthcare increased in real terms in ways they hadn't ever done before? And secondly, if you're going to ask what the working people want, why do you think it's a model? Why do you think working people want one thing as a block? Why do you think people simply ask them and provide? Surely you can recognise there'll be different groups of working people, and that therefore you can't simply say that they're going to target one block on the assumption that they'll share one view. They're as diverse as any other group of people, and they're as likely as them to want different things.
I mean, I can understand what you mean by that, and I do think sometimes it can be an oversimplification. But what I'm trying to say and what I'm trying to put across is that while Blair was quite successful at offering some kind of improvements for working people, it very much came through a bureaucratic, state-moded way. They didn't actually offer them much in the way of power. And I think a lot of the reason why the Conservatives were so successful was that they were able to speak to people who felt they were being patronised for such a long time. And I completely agree. I do think I've been generalising here. But what I mean by working people is just communities, and that's not even necessarily left behind communities. I mean, from places as broad as Bradford to Essex, there are working people. Working class doesn't just mean a factory worker. That's not how class works anymore in this country. It can be white-collar workers, it can be blue-collar workers, but they are still make up the vast proportion of people in this country, and I do think they have been broadly ignored and patronised for such a long time. I just think we need to look outside of this small bubble that we are in and start to seriously consider the future of this country and the fact that we will not be able to win elections off the basis of enlightened liberals. The Labour Party is not a liberal party, it is a workers' party. And if it wants to remain a workers' party, it has to pay attention to what workers are voting for and what they are saying they demand. Even if that is something that we find personally to be distasteful as enlightened liberals, that is something that is extremely important to consider. So I think that's about all I have to say. I've been ranting at you for quite a while, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Poppy, for a wonderful speech. We will come now to our fourth speaker tonight and our second for the opposition. Eleanor Stiles is a first-year student at Pembroke College, studying history and politics. She won this slot through open audition. Eleanor, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for allowing me to speak. And I'd like to start my speech by addressing some of the points that have been raised in the debate thus far. Firstly, I think the history of Labour has been misrepresented and almost romanticised within this debate. We've heard that the point of Labour is simply to resist the domination of capital. We've heard that it is only a workers' party and that this is the inherent point or tradition of Labour, which I simply think isn't really true. If we look at the foundation of the Labour Representation Committee back at the start of the 20th century, we can see it was an association of not only trade unions, but socialist intellectuals and philanthropists, for example, the Fabian Society or the Independent Labour Party. So I think going forward in this debate, we need to be careful about romanticising Labour as only representing a singular interest group as opposed to its ideological position, which I think is more representative of its history. Secondly, I'd like to share my concern that Jessica raised over the tenets of Blue Labour. Whilst family, faith and flag, or however they're arranged, I can't quite remember, aren't inherently problematic, I think they can very easily be co-opted for evil in our society. For example, faith. No one can deny that faith is an integral part of communities, but what kind of faith are we promoting? Is it singularly a Christian faith that ought to be involved in the state, or are we representing a multicultural Britain? Same with the family dynamic. No one can deny families are important parts of communities and a source of support. But are we promoting the nuclear family model, which is heteronormative and often to the degradation and detriment of women's rights? Furthermore, we've discussed the idea of globalisation, that apparently Labour, without moving towards conservatism, isn't addressing the problematic elements of globalisation, particularly for the working class. However, isn't conservatism inherently laissez-faire? Doesn't it promote a hands-off approach to the economy? If we're looking to mitigate the effects of globalisation on working people, then shouldn't we be moving away from conservatism? And finally, I sort of take issue with the characterisation of the working class, as mentioned in the floor speech. There almost seems to be a vilification of the working class, that they somehow are all bigoted and socially regressive, which just isn't true. YouGov found that in the 2019 election, red wall voters, when they were socially less progressive, that this was in line with the population at large. Furthermore, almost or around half, I can't quite remember the statistic, said that a multicultural Britain of different races was for the betterment of society. So I'd just like to remind everyone that working. Yes, taken. Well, I promise I'm getting to that in the rest of my speech. I merely wanted to address the characterization of the working class. I think they're not voting for us for on a variety of reasons. Leadership, economics, the outward-looking... That indeed is a factor. Thank you. So hopefully I'll come to address your point in the rest of it, and if you still don't think I've fully explained it, we can speak afterwards. Which brings me on brilliantly to my speech. The NHS, the Equal Pay Act, and minimum wage are all examples of Labour's achievements. When we look at what makes Labour successful, we see the unique dynamism and conviction of Labour policy. But when we look at what makes it weak, we see the reserve and restraint of a party drifting towards conservatism. I'll be arguing that a movement in this direction undermines the innovation and identity of the Labour Party and will not only fail to address but exacerbate issues of support. If the party moves in this way, it will be turning its back on its history, its values, and its prospects for re-election. In short, it should not and cannot end up in this position. I think a good place to start is looking at the motion itself. Many of us here tonight might imagine that this debate is a discussion on the inevitable progression of the future, as if party politics is somehow set in stone and we merely need to discuss where the party is going. However, I think it's more useful to see politics as fluid and changeable, because party politics is responsive. People like you and me debating in this room, indeed it's my first time speaking at this union, can show Labour leadership or become Labour leadership to avoid a future in which the party is a casualty of conservatism. No one can deny that Labour's electoral performance in recent history has been less than stellar. In fact, disastrous might be a more fitting description. Having fallen from over 400 seats at the beginning of the 21st century to just 202 in 2019, Labour has lost the confidence of its traditional strongholds and is failing to engage new supporters. This doesn't mean, however, that a move towards conservatism is an appropriate or effective political response. The best way to illustrate this is by outlining conservatism, not to conflate it with the Conservative Party, but to look at it as a political theory. There are lots of iterations and developments of conservatism from the New Right to One Nation, which I imagine the proposition might try to use to explain why it's not entirely individualistic. However, all strands of it share a common theme. Conservatism is, at its core, reactionary. It is traditional. It seeks to change only in order to maintain. In short, it aims to conserve. Labour, on the other hand, promises change. It promises to tackle systematic issues within our society rather than offering some mediating concession when the tension boils over. I can't see who it is, but taken.
Do people not actually want, surely doesn't the population at large just want to be able to get on their daily lives, to be able to spend time with their family? Actually, what most people want in this country is for governments to maintain a level of prosperity, whereby politics can swing to the background. Whether conservative values around family, around faith, can come to the fore, but people can get them focused on the private sphere.
Thank you. I don't deny that people want to be left to get on with their everyday life. However, I think that Labour is offering people the opportunity, or has traditionally offered people the opportunity, to do so with more comfort. By adding workers' protections, people are able to spend more time with their family. It's about improving those conditions rather than just accepting them as they are. For example, in 1948, the Labour Party instituted the National Health Service, regardless of the traditions of private healthcare. New Labour overturned traditions of constitutional practices to make Britain a more fair and accessible society. And in 2010, Labour put in place legal protections to prevent discrimination, a proactive measure to prevent harm. Here we can see that Labour's proudest moments are characterised by innovation, not conservation. Even now, the key manifesto points for Labour represent the choice for something different. As I was just saying, Labour doesn't want or never has accepted society as it is. We want to make it better. It is fundamentally clear that Labour's guiding principle is one of progression. The 2019 party manifesto, I imagine, will be discussed greatly in this debate. Yes?
Isn't always good progress. There can be such thing as bad progress.
Thank you. Obviously, progress for the sake of progress shouldn't be advocated for, but progress to make society a more fair and equal place, which I believe is the driving principle, at least, of this Labour Party, I believe is a good thing. So whilst in an abstract sense, progress isn't necessarily beneficial, progress in the sense that Labour is suggesting, I believe is. I'm not going to take another point, thank you. Now, I'm sure many of us are familiar with the Sun's prophecy of Britain in the core bin. And whilst this policy position was very controversial, well discussed, that doesn't mean that it warrants a move towards conservatism. Labour values and Conservative values do not exist on a spectrum. You do not move from Labour to Lib Dem in the middle across to Conservatives. That's simply not the way it works. You cannot move from a position in which the state is responsible for bettering society to a position where the state is responsible for maintaining society. No, thank you. I think it was Michael Oakeshott who compared running a government to captaining a ship. He suggested that conservatism was preferable in that it focused on keeping the ship afloat rather than steering it to an ideological port. But I'd like to remind the members of this room that one doesn't get on a ship simply to float. You go on a ship to move. And to use Oakeshott again as I bring this speech to a close, he described conservatism as a preference for present laughter over utopian bliss. But I think it's clear to all of us that large swathes of society are not laughing. If Corbyn was too optimistic in shooting for a utopia, then Labour can move more slowly and more gently, but it must keep moving. The future for Labour cannot be conservative because conservatism is, at its core, antithetical to Labour's guiding principles. Labour cannot be conservative because it is dynamic, because it is progressive, because it is hopeful. Labour cannot be conservative because Labour is Labour. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor, for a wonderful speech. If you have some degree of quiet over the house, thank you very much. We will come now to our final round of floor speeches tonight, and I start by saying, is there anyone who would like to speak in proposition? Anyone who hasn't? You haven't spoken yet today, so we'll go at the back there. Name and college, please, as well.
Clare College. So when I started writing notes, when the speakers started speaking, the thing I wrote down first was that Labour must conserve, not through choice, but through necessity. The fundamental pillar of conservatism that the Labour Party must seek to adopt, mainly in the electoral sense, is pragmatism. And that's been missed today in this debate. Labour must conserve the union. The arithmetic to win without Scottish and Welsh MPs simply does not exist. That's been missed by all speakers today. Labour must conserve our exit from the EU, regardless of our point of view. The arithmetic to win an election simply does not exist without this key policy. Labour must conserve the transition it made under Tony Blair. That has been missed today. Blair's success as a new Labour politician was based in the fact that he took a Labour Party that had success in the 50s and created the NHS, and he modernised it. He removed Clause 4. That fundamental commitment to nationalisation was something that, when lost from the Labour manifesto, brought them success at the beginning of this century. Fundamentally, if Labour wants to be seen as a political community suitable to ever govern this country again, it needs to conserve what remains of its identity. It needs to conserve its working class Labour movement, not some inner city, upper middle class, metropolitan, university elite that's putting Sir Keir Starmer, Sir, and St Pancras MP next to Jeremy Corbyn and Islington MP and failing and neglecting the North, neglecting Scotland, neglecting Wales. That pragmatism, that internal pragmatism, is what the Labour Party needs, not some external idealism. It needs to look inwards pragmatically, not outwards idealistically.
Thank you very much. I I feel we may need to break the tradition tonight and apparently take a floor speech from a side. I don't know if this is on, but he's very keen, so we'll go with Freddie. Thank you.
I'll step down from the stage. I'm no longer a floor side chair. I'm really tired, and not just because this debate really started very late. It's because I feel like I've been hearing this debate for years. The debate about the future of the Labour Party. So I'm speaking abstention because I want to say there is no future for the Labour Party. The worst year in British electoral history, 1906. That's when the Labour Representation Committee, good they shortened their name, no longer the Labour, they're Labour. That's when they finally made some significant progress in this country. And it set in motion the beginning of the end for my party, the Liberal Party. No, thank you. So I want to say that there is no future for the Labour Party, and we shouldn't want there to be. Because I think most of us in this room, Keir and James notwithstanding, think that the major thing that we should be fighting for is to stop stop Tory rule of Britain. Well, if you're looking for a party that over the last 200 years has done that significantly better than the Labour Party, I can tell you it's the Liberals. Now we've had a tough go of it recently, I'll admit. We've had a tough go of it recently, I'll admit. But, and I promised this would be a short speech, so I'll wrap it up. But the fact is, Labour have had their 100 years in the sun, and they failed. They failed year after year after year. When the Liberals were in charge, we won. So back the Liberals again, because we can get the Tories out, Labour can't.
I'm not sure what I expected there, but it was probably about that. Right, can we move swiftly on, please? Does anyone want to make a speech in opposition? There's a very keen hand over there, so I think we'll go there. Can we get a microphone around or down?
Hello. I haven't spoken at one of these yet. This is my first time, so excuse me. I'm Daniel Brown Moreno, and I'm at Robinson College.
Close.
Oh, sorry. Daniel Brown Moreno at Robinson College. I don't profess to have all the answers or anything, but I should like to make 2 points addressing each of the previous two speakers. First of all, to Eleanor, I had, she's gone, I had a great deal of hope in that speech, and I was really disappointed because I felt that it may well have been true that some voters did feel patronised by Labour's precise identity politics, but it was patently untrue what she said, that while the Conservative Party offered some scraps, that the Labour Party offered nothing. If you read either of the last two manifestos of the Labour Party, there was quite substantial material policy that would have benefited the working class and would have benefited many of the northern communities, which... Right, but did anybody read that? The point, I might agree, to be honest, but the point is that the idea that Eleanor suggested was that the Conservative Party has somehow offered more materially to working class people, which is just patently untrue. There's many ambitious policies about the Green New Deal, about transportation, about nationalisation, which really transcend just the idea of identity politics. And I'd really like to, one other quick point, just to echo a point that Poppy had made, that really that conservatism is just about present laughter over the future bliss. And that really rings true because I think the younger generation of which we're part of is really a vastly progressive generation. And I think we're going to need a party that is in line with our values when we've already entered the electorate, but when the rest of us enter the electorate. And I think it would be really foolish to give up the prospect of our votes in the future just for the sake of scoring a few points in a basically irrelevant culture war that's going on now, which won't even be relevant in a couple decades' time. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that. We'll come now to our final round of main speeches for tonight. And our final speaker for the proposition, is Paul Embury. Paul Embury is a British unheard journalist, a trade union activist, and a pro-Brexit campaigner and blue Labour thinker. He is the author of Despised, Why the Modern Life Loathes the Working Class. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, President. One thing I think we can all agree on is that a major rupture has occurred between the Labour Party and what you might call its traditional working class base. That rupture has seen voters and constituencies that could once be described as dyed-in-the-wool Labour turn their backs on the party. Millions of working class people who once saw the party as the organ which spoke for them, which fought for their interests, no longer see it in that way. And these people have caused a fundamental realignment in British politics. And it's my firm view that if the Labour Party doesn't win those voters and constituencies back, then it's unlikely to win a general election ever again. Today's Labour Party, in reality, is dominated largely by two factions, both of which are completely wrong in their diagnosis of the problem. On the one hand, the radical left, which thinks Labour didn't win power under Jeremy Corbyn because his leadership was sabotaged by plotters and backstabbers, or because too many voters were imbued with false consciousness, or because the media was too hostile to the party. On the other, the liberal left, comprised of so-called centrists or moderates who were in charge of the party for so long and think that the clock need only be wound back to the day before Jeremy Corbyn took over to see the party win back popular support. In fact, the disconnect between the Labour Party and its one-time core vote isn't a recent phenomenon. It began to materialise way back during the first decade of this century. For that was the period when working class communities across our land began to be affected, perhaps I should say afflicted, in the most profound way by the effects of the new global market. I saw this up close and personal because I was living in such a community at the time. On the one hand, widespread deindustrialisation resulting in the loss of thousands of blue-collar jobs as production was shipped abroad, the type of jobs that gave working-class communities a sense of pride and security. On the other, a very rapid and deep demographic change that fragmented common bonds, abused the good faith and tolerance of local people, and violated their sense of place and belonging. And when these communities looked to the Labour government, their government, to come to their aid as they were caught in this perfect storm, they found that Labour had actually embraced this new way of living and working in the name of social and economic progress. The Labour Party looked at these communities and told them to suck it up because these developments were good for them, economically, culturally. In fact, it wasn't unusual for some in the party to dismiss these objectors as bigots, nativists, or worse. The treatment of Gillian Duffy is testament to that. But for most people living in working class communities across post-industrial, provincial, blue-collar, small-town Britain, particularly England, it was their sense of place and not their sense of race that had been violated by these far-reaching changes. What Labour failed to understand in its rush to embrace the new global cosmopolitan liberalism, what it still fails to understand, is that there has always been, as my colleagues have said, that small c conservative thread running through many of our working class communities. Not large C Conservative Party, many of them are extremely hostile or were to the Conservative Party, but small c conservative thread, because even though they're dismissed as backward or reactionary, actually it's in these places where, because wealth and opportunity are less, there is usually a heightened sense of rootedness, a desire for stability, for familiarity, for workplace security, cultural security, and so on. Yeah, give way.
Surely the answer then is to spread that wealth and opportunity to areas so that people aren't competing for scarce jobs. And I'm also wanted just to ask about this idea of, you said, a violation of the community because of the incursion of, I presume, people who didn't come from that area, people who might be foreign born. Would you like to reflect on that? Because I think that is quite important for you to be held accountable to this place today about what you mean in relation to the violation of communities by those from ethnic communities.
Well, on the first point, absolutely, I believe in redistributing wealth between rich and poor. That's why I'm in the Labour Party and have been in the Labour Party for the best part of 27 years. And I don't use language such as incursions. I'm pro-immigration. Most of the Labour movement, in fact, I think all of the Labour movement, rightly so, is pro-immigration. The question isn't whether we should be pro or anti-immigration in the Labour movement. The question is how we regulate the system, how we manage it, whether we do it in a way that people are comfortable with and allows communities to live a life of peace and harmony with people coming in to that community. If you don't regulate it properly and don't manage it properly, and frankly, it can be reduced to a numbers game if we're honest about it, then you do fragment common bonds and you put pressure on community relations and public services. So don't run away with the idea that to be pro-immigration, you have to be open borders. You most certainly do not. And going back to the question of these communities, these are often communities which do place a higher value on belonging and social solidarity, on the principle of reciprocity, of patriotism, on traditionalism, concepts which are now seen by many on the left as inherently right-wing, but were once upon a time perfectly compatible with voting for the Labour Party. And yes, voters in these communities may be more inclined to speak on the doorstep about issues such as law and order and immigration and national security than, say, climate change or LGBT rights or Palestine or the latest calls promoted by those who peddle radical identity politics. That's because circumstances often compel them to order their priorities in a way different to the way that the more well-heeled order theirs. But when they voiced their priorities, they often found, and I saw it with my own eyes, that Labour activists stared down at the ground and shuffled their feet in embarrassment. History shows, and this comes back to some of the points that was made by the opposition, history shows that the Labour Party was always at its best and most successful when it was able to hold together an electoral coalition that won the support of places such as blue-collar Hartlepool, liberal, fashionable Hampstead, and inner-city, ethnically diverse Hackney. Nice bit of alliteration, I'm sure you'll agree. But the first in that list, working class, blue-collar, post-industrial Britain, the Hartlepools of our land, once the party's heartlands, have been elbowed aside as the other two have come to dominate, and that is the problem. And that's largely because the Labour Party itself has undergone a very profound transformation demographically and ideologically over the past 3 decades. And I say that, as I said before, as a long-standing activist in the Labour movement. It's a transformation I've seen with my own eyes. The reality is, and it's a tragedy in many respects, but the reality is that the party is now largely a party of, as Poppy Coburn called them, the professional and managerial classes. A party of middle-class liberals and graduates living in our fashionable cities and university towns. A party of social activists and, dare I say, student radicals. A party of Twitter and what you might call the wokerati. And too often, it voices the priorities of those groups at the expense of its former base. And it's no coincidence that as that transformation began to take hold in the party, working class voters gradually at first from the turn of the century, then dramatically in 2019, deserted it. These voters today look at Labour and see a party that has abandoned its historical purpose to speak for people like them, traditional working class voters living in the disadvantaged parts of our nation, the Britain beyond the cities. They think the party despises them and wants to drag them out of their ignorance, and they're not completely wrong. Too often, Labour has treated traditional working class voters as some kind of embarrassing elderly relative. The party wants their votes at election time, but doesn't want to be seen in public with them. And if Labour is to win these people back and ever stand a chance of forming a government, it needs a complete ideological overhaul. It can't appeal exclusively to working class blue-collar voters. That's not the route to electoral success. But it must at least stop repelling them. It must welcome them back into the old Labour coalition and show them that it speaks their language and shares their priorities. It needs to start using the language of family, work, community, nation, things that have a concrete meaning to those voters in such a way that buzzwords such as equality and diversity and inclusivity can never do.
On that point. What if the future of Labour then is neither liberal nor conservative, but it's a movement that stands against exploitation of all kinds and for the values of family, friendship and freedom?
Well, the history of Labour, as Maurice pointed out, has always been a history of radicalism and conservatism. That is the paradox. But the conservative element of it not the large C, the small conservative element has been elbowed aside as the other traditions have come to dominate. So I agree we need to appeal across the piece. What we saw at the general elections in 2017 and 2019 is that promises of economic justice, much as I'm in favour of that, are not by themselves enough. I'm not going to give way, it's my last minute. Labour must fuse its economic radicalism with the cultural politics of belonging, something that will make large parts of the party uncomfortable, but which will prove the difference between, in the future, being a middle-class pressure group or a party of government. In short, Labour must rediscover the conservative side of its history, its patriotic and communitarian tradition, because only then might the millions of working-class voters who have abandoned the party start to look at it again.
Thank you very much, Paul. We come now to our final speaker of the night and our third for the opposition. As you can tell by the sheer length of the bio we have written down for him, Ben Bradshaw is a pretty remarkable individual. He served as Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport at the very end of the Brown government, and is a Member of Parliament for Exeter and has been since 1997. Ben held senior positions in both the Blair and Brown administrations and is one of Labour's most active supporters of LGBTQ+ rights. Ben, the floor is yours.
I'm going to start with an apology to Morris because I didn't understand most of his speech. But then I'm not a political scientist or an intellectual. I'm just a simple political hack, a political practitioner who won a Conservative seat 24 years ago and still hold it with a 10,000 majority. In that seat, I win working class voters, I win middle class voters, I win upper class voters. I'm not fussy, but I'm Labour and I help deliver Labour governments, which, if we want a Labour government, is what we need to do. I agree with a lot of what Morris said. I agree that we need community. I agree that there must be a role for the state. I agree that globalization is a challenge, but I don't believe we can stop the world and get off. We have to meet the challenge of globalization, do what we can do to protect working people and everything else. And what are the big problems of this world can we now solve on our own in a global world? We can't. Climate change, migration, workers' rights, taxation, all of these big challenges that individual nation states face can only be solved by being outward-looking, internationalist, cooperating with other countries, not closing ourselves off in an economy with barriers put up around our borders. I was 13 years a member of a Labour government that was outward-looking, was global, but it also massively improved the lot of working people in this country, massively reduced inequality, invested masses of money in the public services on which ordinary working people depend. Yes, of course.
Say they massively reduced inequality. The Gini coefficient, which is the best measure of inequality we have, went up during the years that Labour was in government. It reached its peak under the new Labour government. Labour was bad for inequality. They've made inequality worse for their government. That is a statistical fact.
Well, I don't know what the Guinea whatever it is, but I do know that we lifted more than 1 million pensioners out of poverty. We lifted nearly 1 million children out of poverty. We invested in schools. We invested in hospitals. We introduced working tax credits for working families. We set up Sure Starts to give young people the best start in life. We did all the kinds of things that you need to do to raise aspiration and social mobility, all of which has been swept away in the last 11 years of conservatism. Yes, of course I give way.
The middle class that this is a point information. Yes,
I'm actually getting used to the norms of this debate, but I just want to point out that the middle class across the world have an equal, have a very comparable share of the national income. What is different is how much the rich captures the income of the poor. And in fact, with societies in which there is a lot of inequality, the rich have captured more from the poor than societies in which there is inequality.
Thank you. Thank you so much for demolishing the guinea, whatever it is. Do I get an extra minute? Okay. Where was I before I was so helpfully interrupted? I also absolutely agree with Poppy and with Paul that Labour needs to win back support in working class areas. We need to win back a lot of seats, not just in the Red Wall seats, but in Scotland and in other areas. But, you know, there was one main explanation for our worst election defeat in 2019, and that was Jeremy Corbyn. It's two words, Jeremy Corbyn, the other was Brexit. The idea that this was a rejection of Labour, it was a rejection of Corbynism, it wasn't a rejection of Labour. We had Labour MPs in a lot of these seats for most of recent history, and I'm quite confident with the balls up that Boris Johnson is making of things at the moment that we'll be able to win those seats back. Yes, of course, Paul.
Would you accept that actually since the turn of the century, the evidence shows that the Labour Party has been progressively losing the working class C2DU vote well before Jeremy Corbyn took over?
Yes, I completely accept that the trend did not start with Jeremy Corbyn, and I don't absolve Ed Miliband of any blame as well. I also agree that we need strong communities, we need strong families. We need a role for the state. I also agree that we need, as Paul said, family, work and community. I don't see that as anything that is not compatible with Labour rather than conservatism. And also, Paul, you said Labour at its best needs to maintain a coalition. Exactly. We win when we maintain a coalition of working class voters, of middle class voters, of intellectuals, of minorities, of people of colour. This is the Labour coalition, so why narrow it down to conservatism and alienate and put off those parts of the Labour coalition that we're going to have to keep to win the next election? And actually, as the young person said in his intervention, who are getting more in number as those conservative Labour voters are getting fewer. It doesn't make electoral sense to me. We've done it in the past. We can do it again. I don't underestimate the challenge.
On that point,
yes, of course.
When Labour, to form a government, has got to win seats, it has to win seats off Conservatives.
Exactly.
Which means that it's got to have a certain element of appeal to these Conservative voters and has to embrace some Conservative element. So the future of Labour, to be able to form a government, has got to be able to embrace a level of conservatism in order to be able to affect the change that...
But you're assuming that all the people who voted Conservative and not Labour in 2019 think of themselves as Conservative. Lots of them don't think of themselves as Conservative. They voted Conservative because they didn't want Jeremy Corbyn. They want more opportunities for their families. They want good schools. They want a good health service. They want less inequality. Those are Labour values. And if we can communicate those and show people that we can run the economy competently, and we have a leader that the public can imagine being Prime Minister, we can win those voters back. I've never lost those voters in Exeter. I've never lost those voters in Exeter, because in Exeter we have a Labour brand that the people, including our traditional working class peoples, like and support, because we deliver for them day in, day out at local level. Now, finally, going back to Morris. Morris, you said the Labour Party is Catholic and Protestant. It's patriotic and internationalist. It is. It's all of those things. It's all of those things. So why just conservatism? Why narrow it down? Why exclude it's conservative and progressive? That's not the motion. Your motion is the future of Labour is conservatism.
It's radical and conservative.
You didn't say that. You didn't say that. You didn't say that. It is radical and conservative, but that's not the motion. The motion is the future of Labour is conservatism. And finally, incidentally, it's grammatically incorrect because it's conservatism with a capital C. It can't be conservatism. It can't be conservative with a capital C because there is a Conservative Party. It could be conservatism with a small c, but that's not the motion. So... On very, very serious political grounds, you have to reject this motion, but you also do on grammatical grounds too. Thank you.
Thank you, Thank you very much, Ben. If I may just make a point on grammar, I have always been a great advocate of sentence case, and you'll notice in the term card that it is lowercase c. I do concede the order paper is different, and we shall have an internal crisis meeting about capitalisation henceforth. So apologies for the inconsistency there. Also, one other point before we wrap up tonight. I don't want to sound too draconian, some would say Stalinist, but I would just like to say very briefly, I love points of information. I'm so pleased that so many of you were so keen tonight, but please keep them short. We have speakers here, and I'm very much hoping that they get a chance to speak at great length, and they do it in 2 people's time. So in future, thank you very, very much for raising them, but let's try from next week onwards just to curtail them ever so slightly. What I would like to say that is of much greater importance than all of that is firstly, thank you very much to our wonderful guests for speaking with us tonight. Before you go, you can, well, hold on, we'll do claps in a second. Before you go, the no's, abstentions, and the ayes doors, or you can vote for upstairs. There is no abstention door, so simply be decisive. In terms of events coming up, our debates this week are on weird days. We have a debate on Tuesday on free will and one on Saturday on literature. There is no Thursday night debate. Instead, on Thursday, we have the Governor of the Bank of England. On Wednesday, Jordan Peterson. And on Friday, Stephen Fry. See you there for all of that. Thank you very much and good night.